Alrighty, greetings and various assorted salutations. This lecture is part of a two-part series. This is part one. On 1950s Americana, the Golden Age. This is part of the Cold War lecture series. But covers 15.5 in our textbook. Here's the key terms. Basically what this is the time of the greatest generation, as they call themselves. These are the Americans who grew up during the darkest hours of the Great Depression. As youths, they fought and won World War II against the Nazis and the Japanese. And this is when many people get nostalgic for the good old days in America. This is the time period that they're thinking of, the 1950s after America won the war. The country seemed completely united, its people were prosperous, and the world was seeing America as a shining city on the hill. Or, well, we were seeing ourselves as that shining city on the hill. Of course, memory isn't perfect, but we'll break things down and learn more about it in this two-part series. First off, we need to look at the factors of American prosperity. With the end of World War II, many soldiers came home and used their GI Bill. The GI Bill of Rights was basically the idea of, for your loyalty to the United States of America and your service in World War II, or your service in the military in general, because many of the GI Bill benefits still exist to this day if you serve in the military. The GI Bill rewarded dedicated Americans for their service. It allowed American veterans to get special loan offers at reduced rates for businesses and buying homes. It gives them the GI Bill, which covers a lot of covers tuition for going to college. Veterans often received hiring preferences, especially in federal jobs, government positions. There's unemployment benefits, there's disability coverage, and medical support through the Veterans Affairs hospitals, the VA. We have one of those VA hospitals in our area, for example, one of the bigger ones. The other thing we see contributing to the prosperity of America is the baby boom of after World War II. Families grew after World War II. Following the greatest generation was the baby boomers. They were the products of lots of American families being very rapidly formed. Essentially, between 1940 and 1955, the United States population would grow by 27%, almost entirely through childbirths. But a lot of soldiers coming home married their childhood sweethearts, and that's kind of what produces this nostalgic view of coming home and starting a family after the war. This also created the idea of the ideal American family, what we would call the nuclear family. It's a household that consists of a mother, father, and their biological children. TV and public perception paints this image as the ideal family. Hint, middle class. The qualities of the American nuclear family is going to be, it's frequently middle class. The father is the breadwinner and fully employed, a man's man kind of view. The mother is considered the homemaker and primary raiser of the children. There's 2 or 3 children in that family that they listen to their parents, they obey authority figures, and they grow up to be honest people like their parents. Frequently, these families also live in the suburbs. This is the ideal nuclear family as pictured here. Mother, father, 2 children, suburban lawn, barbecue. When you think Americana, 1950s is when this image starts to form. The house is probably new in the background. These families would often live out in the growing suburbs around America's major cities. because that was where people could commute in to work, but still have a nice lawn and kind of be away from the city, as the mentality of the suburbs. Now, these growing families do mean the consumption and purchasing of goods and services. Many Americans were worried about the end of World War II because all the military jobs would disappear. Soldiers who had been fighting in the war, most of them aren't needed in peacetime. The women working in the factories building ammunition, the people down in New Orleans building the Higgin boats. There's just not a need to build all these things when there's nobody blowing them up or shooting these weapons. And so there's a big worry that there'd be a recession. There was a bit of one, but Americans quickly met the demands through consumption. Americans wanted more beef. They wanted to buy cars. They bought TVs. There were movies to watch, places to travel, children to raise, toys to buy, houses to build. These demands drove the American economy. These soldiers came home and they wanted to make up for lost time. These families wanted to ensure that their children would not live through the minimalism of the Great Depression. The Cold War also drives a lot of new goods to be purchased. Thanks to keep the West capitalist, the U.S. military developed tons and tons of things. Billions of dollars of research were poured in, and technology was pushed further and further through the Cold War. Many of the devices that civilians use had a military application. For example, Teflon was developed for holding nuclear radioactive things. It was modified for pots and pans. Satellites were used for military, could be used for communication, be it TV or entertainment. Many things will start to develop. That isn't to say they existed in the 50s, but things started developing in the 50s. As you can see, there's the nuclear family enjoying life. Perhaps enjoying a family evening after father returns home from work. That's the perception we see here. The daughter's with her doll, the boy's with a book. All these things are bought, all these things are made. Consumption. Bought. The other thing that really helps the U.S. economy is the fact that the Second World War destroyed much of the world. American companies found that much of their competition had been blasted off the face of the earth. So things such as the Marshall Plan would bring American money and investment and products to various corners of the world. Later in this time period, companies like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Levi Jeans, Hollywood Films, these would dominate the global market and bring money home to the United States. But let's look at what is going on more in the American home. What are Americans buying? Cars are definitely one thing. President Eisenhower, remembering his days when he was the Allied Supreme Commander in Europe, saw the German Autobahns, which was a highway system built by the federal government of Germany under the Nazis. And Eisenhower said the United States needs an interstate system, a highway system. And so I-90 that you drive on, that was originally put in there for defensive purposes. It also is great for economic purposes as well and travel. Think of it this way. Before the 1960s, there were no interstates. One had to weave around the country using various highways and county roads to get from one point to the other, or taking trains. Different trains to different stations and bounce around. It's on these interstates that Americans would drive their new cars. National parks became popular in this time period because before only the rich could easily get to them, but now the average middle-class American family could at least, they would make their journeys to these different parks. Disney World practically became a pilgrimage site for the American middle class. Road trip, anyone? One of the other big factors that Americans had is the average American now had access to things that no previous generation had access to. There was electricity, television, and the entertainment industry could now pipe in entertainment directly into people's homes in ways that were not possible previously. It all costs money, but spending drives the economy and drives industries to grow and more jobs to be created, which means more opportunities emerge. Most Americans would see their incomes increase, and that would help them meet the demands of the consumer culture that was forming. Boomers and the greatest generation also benefited tremendously from being able to buy things on credit. The idea of buy it now, pay for it later gets really set into this generation. Some more pictures of Hollywood. Now, all of this is going to be changing American society as well. Americans are going to be moving. Thanks to the war, many families had already moved. For example, many African Americans had moved out of the Deep South already to take industrial jobs in places like Detroit and Chicago. But more people would move after the war as well. Places like California had been built up due to the war because things needed to be made in California because that was closer to the Pacific Front. And so many Americans would start moving to places in the South and the West. This is what we call the Sun Belt. One of the things that really helps with this is air conditioning becomes standard, more accessible to the average person. When air conditioning was initially invented, it was used for industrial purposes, but portable units, window-mounted units were developed in this time period, and so people were more interested in living in warmer climates. I'm sure as the winter settles in, you students will understand where that Sun Belt living mentality is coming from. America also received a bunch of refugees moving in. Wars and conflicts in Latin America would bring a lot of people in. People fleeing communism from Eastern Europe would bring a lot of Germans and other people from Eastern Europe in. Because for many people, especially after World War II, America was the land of opportunity. In fact, our Jewish population would go up immensely after World War II. Many Jews would abandon Europe permanently in numbers that Jewish numbers have never recovered in Europe. But getting into the quality of life, this is another factor. Numerous technological and medical developments dramatically improve Americans' quality of life. Antibiotics developed out of wartime interests are used to drive back childhood diseases like tuberculosis and whooping cough. The vaccine for polio would save thousands of lives. The blood banks that were developed for the war are going to help out Americans again. Childhood survival rates are going to be a really big factor. That's partially why the population grew, is children just were not dying in the numbers that they used to. Pandemics, the wretched childhood diseases that ran throughout this country, would fade into memory until, well, this more recent era. America really hasn't seen pandemics for decades. Until recently, because of medical developments coming out of World War II, particularly. But no. America also undergoes a religious revival, so many Americans are going to church in this time period. Billy Graham drew many people into religion. Catholicism, the Roman Catholic Church, sees an increase in numbers. In fact, when you're going across America, there's going to be many Catholic churches that have building dates from like the 50s and 60s because their congregations grew so dramatically. As I stated before, Judaism skyrockets in America. Many people from Europe come in. Judaism also builds many synagogues. There's many Jews in America as a result of World War II. Part of the American identity in Americana stems from religion. This is in opposition to the communists. The communists were atheist. The capitalists of America saw themselves as the religious. In fact, the Pledge of Allegiance would come to include "In God We Trust" during this time period. But this is Americana, the golden age of America, or at least that's how it feels. Dwight D. Eisenhower will be our president in this time period. The general who led America to victory in Europe. He was liked by Democrats and Republicans. He easily slid into office in 1952. After World War, under Eisenhower, America saw peace. The horrors of World War II ended because of American heroism. And that idea of American prosperity. Each American had contributed to this society. And now many Americans felt that in the 50s that America was cashing in on the hard work and suffering of that they had endured before. As many of you might imagine, all of this almost feels like a dream. It is grounded in reality, though. America did win World War II. Economic prosperity was unprecedented at this time period. American families were growing. Many Americans were achieving dreams that previous generations had not achieved in such large numbers. The American dream really seems to... People think of this time period when they think of America's golden age. However, that's not the whole picture. And in the next lecture, part 2, we're going to see that there's an undercurrent to the Americana of the 1950s that will actually set us up for the more turbulent 60s and 70s in America. Because, nostalgia we're looking back on a different era. I'm going to wrap it up here, and I'll see you in the next lecture.